All right, welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez. You can find me pretty much everywhere as Nerd Numbers. And with me, as always, is my co-host, producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. You can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Say hey, Brian.
What's going on, Dre? And just to tease a little something, you're going to the Sloan Analytics Conference this week, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And, you know, I sent you guys an email yesterday saying something like, maybe we can skip the show this week. There's the All-Star game, not a lot going on. Well, then this big Mavericks article from Jessica Luther hit, and we've got a lot to talk about today.
So to be fair, our normal MO is to record, whether it be Wednesday or Thursday, because that's always up in the air, and then the day after news breaks or an article comes out. So I'm hoping that doesn't hit, because if something bigger than these sets of stories come out, we'll talk the second. Well, let's see if I can get this. We'll talk the first story second and the second story first. So the two stories that broke kind of in succession and kind of confused me on my Twitter feed were, first, Mark Cuban basically in an interview, I forget with who, was talking about how tanking is the right strategy for the Mavs, and how he's basically telling his team to tank. And I guess I didn't realize this, but you told me he has been fined $600,000 for that.
Yeah.
In response to this, Dave Barry penned a piece over at Forbes about how the Mavs may want to look at their own history for why tanking doesn't work, and how when the Mavs were successful, it wasn't via tanking. We'll get to that. Like I said, that's our second topic. The story, the much bigger story, is huge shout out to Jessica Luther, and we were both just saying his name right before the show, John Wertheim, I think is how you say it.
Yep.
Who dropped a bombshell of a piece in Sports Illustrated. And as I mentioned, this is what was confusing me, is I saw all of these people basically going, oh my goodness, Cuban's in trouble. Oh my goodness, I can't believe this is happening to Mark Cuban. And I was like, well, on the one hand, I do think it's a big deal. He said that about tanking, but really, is it this big? But no, it's a much bigger story. And I'm taking words out of your mouth from the pre-show, Brian. One that, at least to this podcast, made us basically feel betrayed, because the story that Jessica Luther and John dropped was essentially about this horrible culture of misogyny and just harassment in the Dallas Mavericks. Admittedly, I guess even in this article, more on the business end than the basketball end. So that's kind of the surprising part, right? Is some of the females who have stepped forward have even said, going into the basketball locker room, considered, the boys' club area or whatever, the players were nice and polite and they never had any problems. But it was when they were dealing with, we were discussing his name, the former president for the Mavericks, and then he went to Under Armour, where he was then fired for basically the same issues. Ussery, I think is how you were saying it.
That's how they pronounce it in the video that goes along with the SI article, but I haven't researched the pronunciation in depth. So
basically, there was 18 years of this guy in control, and it was kind of one of those very Weinstein-y, that's hard to say it, but Harvey Weinstein, or Steen, the same idea, where it was kind of an open secret that this guy was a serial sexual harasser, and you shouldn't be alone with him. And then I don't recall if is this covered in the same article, but then there were also some basically beat reporters who had issues with women as well, who signed basically NDAs where they just wouldn't be alone with women. So essentially, in a good way, I don't want to make this sound as if I'm mad at this, but the sky is essentially falling on the culture of the Dallas Mavericks for essentially the last 20 years, with, in essence, how they've treated women and handled these issues, and basically forced women out of jobs essentially, and how they had a horrible president. So I'll let you talk a little bit more to that.
Yeah, there's another employee. He worked for the Mavericks.com website, and as other people are pointing out, this is just what they are able to report right now. So who knows what's really there? But we didn't talk about this in the pre-show, but when you said it was like the Weinstein brothers situation, yeah, it seems very similar to me. High executives in the Mavericks organization covering up for it. So it's not like this all came out now. There's been complaints about it for years and years and years, contemporaneous notes, all that stuff we're seeing in the other cases. And they just sat on it and protected him. And here's the thing about this. They obviously, the Mavericks deserve a lot of condemnation and hand wringing and all that, but like I said in the email, the show that's just like a bunch of dudes, we're probably the wrong people to do that. Plenty of women smarter than us, like Jessica Luther, are going to do that. So
I just say it's fine to do both, and it just okay. So here is
what I'm saying is I think we're more useful talking about like kind of the business side and the media side and all that. So that's kind of how I'm going to try to frame my analysis.
Advice too on that subject, which is funny because I half cut you off to do it, but effing gamers, at least some of them. I saw something recently this week where a gamer posted out like, the gamer community is like inclusive, and if you don't like it, just shut up and listen, or something to that effect. And I feel a lot of when you're talking about the weird feeling of being, a bunch of guys sitting here talking about this, I don't disagree with you. There are lots of funny memes about like, and by memes I mean like these really happen, but people put them on the web of like, let's talk about women in sports, or let's talk about women in math, and it's a panel of 4 guys, and you're like, seriously, what the hell? But yeah. I would say that the bigger advice, and something you're making sure to stay very cognizant of, is this is a place where if we're talking about this and women step forward, or we talk to women, shut up and listen. Like at that point, it's not your point to talk. So I agree. And then I also say, to kind of your point, like talking where we can is fine. So good. So moving ahead, essentially, major culture problem at the Mavs that's been going on for 20 years, which it's just hard to deal with. And at least I'll give my 2 cents and say, anybody that's like, man, this is upsetting that this is happening, it's like, I'm more of the fan of, if the old guard in a lot of these industries, that's Hollywood, hopefully politics, though politics seems to be taking a little longer, but Hollywood, sports, etc. If these fields that have been rife with, misogyny and other cultural problems for years are just starting to, be forced to turn over the old guard, I'm completely fine with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so to continue that point I was on, about how this has been about how these women have been trying to fight this for all this time, and it just got covered up. So I'll do exactly what I complained about a few minutes ago and pat myself on the back, which is that I've complained about the concept of lean in before on this show several times, right? That's his book, and basically the concept is if women...
Sheryl Sandberg, who
Correct.
was higher up at Google, who I believe CFO, I believe, at Facebook.
She's one of the most famous female executives in Silicon Valley, basically. So yeah, she wrote this book, Lean In. And I haven't read it, to be fair, but one of the concepts of it is that women just need to be more aggressive. That's how they'll succeed in the workplace. And my pushback is, well, maybe if men were less aggressive, that'd be a better idea. And so there's a quote from this article that just made me laugh, and here's what it is. So one of the women says she made Pittman aware. Pittman is the HR guy who was helping to cover all this up. She made Pittman aware countless times. I leaned in so much that I fell over. That's the quote that they dug up for this article. I leaned in so much that I fell over. And what did that do?
Well, so there's two big topics. So one that's interesting about lean, and I actually wrote about this, I believe, at the Wages of Wins back in the day, is how oftentimes people see these really complicated problems and they're tempted to say, here's an easy solution. And a real world example with exactly what Sheryl Sandberg's saying is that people have pointed out a common problem in the wage gap that we see between men and women that is a very real thing. Is essentially men are more likely to negotiate initial offers, which gets a higher base pay, since most raises are percentage based. If you get a higher base, it ups you. And, of course, when you look for a new job, typically they say, what are you currently getting paid, and do based off of that. So that's a big difference between men and women. So the obvious answer, many would think, so I'm clear that this isn't the real answer, but the obvious solution many people thought up is, well, if women just negotiate from the get-go, everything's fine. And we talk a lot about this on the show, about these pervasive standards in our society that are just, they are so hard to fight against because they've been there for years. I read a fantastic post by Noah Penyon, one of the great economics followers I follow on Twitter, about this paper about politics and how a lot of it has to do with race. And it's just really bizarre, but just how these small beliefs of, if there were years of slavery and years of segregation, that even if you consider yourself more progressive, you're going to be fighting against a culture for years that have been feeding you this implicit message of, and we don't agree with this, I'm saying this is the implicit message that is fed through a lot of culture and a lot of history, that minorities are basically substandard to white people in the United States. Again, don't agree with it, saying there's a major cultural problem with that. And to say that there isn't is just naive at this point, and it gets me very flustered when people don't say it. Same exact problem with women in the workplace. Not their fault. We're not blaming. We're not doing the lean in. What you're saying is these are some very important facts to be aware of. It was very uncommon for women to get any jobs outside of basically secretarial, teacher, or nurse work in the workplace until about 40, 50 years ago. It was also like, this is something funny that people may not realize. You weren't allowed to get a credit card as a woman without a husband until like after the 70s. So just keep that in perspective, right? The ABA was around before women were given the right to have lines of credit. And so there are these implicit biases against women in the workplace. So when they do stand up and say, I want a raise, or in a meeting, lean in and say, listen to me, there is often more pushback than there would be for a male. Our recent election's a huge example of this. Trump is incredibly incompetent. That was well known going into the election, even well known now. He could stand up and shout, and people were like, seems like a good leader. Hillary Clinton was, whatever else you want to say about her, and I mean, if you hate politicians, I've got no complaints with this, one of the most qualified political candidates we've had in U.S. presidential history. Now, again, that could be a good or bad thing, because if you hate politicians, being an incredibly qualified politician should make you angry, but whatever. One of the most qualified people we've ever had for the job. And if she spoke up, people were like, man, she sounds really grating. So that's like what you're saying about the lead-in problem. The advice that we give oftentimes are, women, here's how you need to act if you want to get ahead. And that's very... I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. But the reason that falls on its face oftentimes is that essentially you're telling women, and this is a point that Adam Conover of Adam Ruins Everything has brought up, is like, that's fighting culture. And while culture can change over time, over lots of things, to just wage a one-person fight against culture is often a losing battle. I mean, you think about a great example on the show we've had, Patrick and myself, is we both live in states that have very good football teams. And for years, we have bashed CTE and football and the NFL and the problems with sports. And, you know, I bash the NCAA like mad, but I have gone to parties for the NFL. I've gone to parties for the Wisconsin Badgers because that's culture, because all of my friends are doing it. And it is a really, really hard thing to just basically be the one person sitting out and pointing against it. And so that's why I'm saying I'm glad that there is a turnover of the old guard, because a lot of the culture in place in a lot of these front offices, which is a lot of rich males, is to basically say, when women complain to HR, it's just whining and they're exaggerating, as opposed to taking it as seriously as it needed to be taken.
Yeah, and so that's where I want to go kind of to the business side of this is, you know, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of what Mark Cuban was thinking, 20 years ago. So first of all, some of this stuff I think he's denied knowing about, but then other stuff he's kind of said he knew about, but made a bad call on trying to get through it.
Oh, yeah, that was the second point I wanted to get to, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on, is basically this idea of like the asshole high performer.
Yeah, that's where I'm going towards right now. So that's the decision Cuban had to make, right? So we talk about this in the context of, sorry, my cat's getting a little bit hyperactive here. I'm kind of pushing him around. We're going to have to clear him out. So, so we talk about this in basketball, right? You've got like Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan or LeBron James, whoever, who's bad for your culture, but is a really good player and helps you win. It's like, where do you draw the line on that, right? It's a tough call, and we talk about that all the time. In this case, clearly Mark Cuban was wrong in hindsight, right? Like he let this get way out of hand, and if he didn't know about all of it, he was burying his head in the ground and being willfully ignorant. So let's get a quote up from the article on here. This is mostly from anonymous employees and former employees, right, who are worried about retaliation. Trust me, Mark knows everything that goes on. Of course, Mark knew about the instances of harassment and assault. Everyone knew. And Cuban's response, the big difference is that being so close to everything that's going around, you can't bullshit me. So that's like his way to do it, right? And then there's another story here about Cuban kind of being an abusive asshole in this regard. SI obtained an interoffice email from Cuban sent in 2010 complaining about the production value of Mavs telecasts. Who exactly calls for the replays? Cuban wrote, you can tell that person they are about to lose their job if they figured it out. So there's examples here of him, being like an overbearing micromanager in the business area or the broadcast area, at least. Maybe that's slightly different. I don't know. So based on, Jessica Luther's reporting, seems like he knew about all this stuff. So he's trying to make this decision, right? Well, are these few instances of sexual assault worth tanking this executive, or can we weather the storm? Here's another quote from the article. One of the women alleging harassment has another theory. Cuban turned a blind eye as long as the revenue came in, which it did. By all accounts, under Ussery, the Mavericks' finances improved dramatically. He was instrumental in securing $250 million in public funding for American Airlines Center, which opened in 2001. Ussery has also been credited with bringing in the 2010 All-Star Game to Dallas. So he's kind of weighing the decision, right? Where do I go with this? Obviously, in hindsight, he was wrong. And this, these people in the organization were more than high-performing assholes. This is, criminal behavior. So, he failed. He failed to make the right decision here.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been an issue that's really rough. And, this will get into like Bernie Sanders territory, or I'd say more Robert Reich and the point of income inequality. There is a very real issue in the United States with income inequality and how we are basically fine giving so much to the top, because in all of these cases, what you're basically describing is someone worth millions or billions versus a low-level employee. And I've seen a lot of response to this article being how basically HR is weaponized against the employees, where HR is in theory supposed to be for employees to go in and say, here's a problem. But what HR really is doing is going, when an employee comes and complains, they're basically doing cost-benefit analysis. Ironically, one of the most misunderstood movies, I've kind of come to the opinion that satire just fails satire to effectively take on a problem is like the tanking model. It's people think that by satirizing something, they take the wind out of it. And my opinion is like satire is like the most ineffective way to take anything out. So what I'm talking about is the movie Fight Club. As protagonist in the beginning, he works for either an auto company or an auto insurance company. And basically what happens is anytime there is a vehicle wreck, they do the cost benefit analysis of how often is this mistake going to happen? How much are we going to have to pay out the victims when that happens? How expensive would it be to do a recall? If the recall is more expensive than the victim, we just basically let it ride and say we're fine with this fault being in existence in the automobile. So that's his job in the movie. And this has basically been HR for the most thing. It's like, and we've talked a little bit about this, how the NDA has like become one of the most effective methods of keeping these things under wrap, because what happens is an employee comes forward, says, this person, this high performance asshole, mistreated me, and HR goes, well, if we fire them, they have a golden parachute, right? Firing a low level employee, typically maybe 1 or 2 months of severance and COBRA, which is nothing, versus if you fire an executive, that they usually have a golden parachute that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases, depending on the exec. So they go, okay, well, if we're only, I put in quotes, not saying that's okay, I'm saying this is the Fight Club-ish comparison. They're going, if we get 5 to 10 of these complaints a year and we have to pay out, a mid-tier employee's salary for 2 months plus benefits or whatever, and have them sign an NDA, that's worth it. And so that's the problem we're into. So in a way, it's very disheartening, because the thought is, companies just tend to win. I'm going to steal from Jason Pargin at the Cracked podcast, where he's basically said, a lot of times progress, annoyingly, comes through business, where businesses discover it's just not effective anymore to do this. So, for instance, for all of the depression about the EPA and the Trump administration and the GOP and global warming, businesses are starting to realize that, if climate change is bad and old technologies like coal are bad, no business wants to get into the coal business anymore. It's not profitable.
Dre, here's a great example of that. Net neutrality got struck down recently, and how many ISPs have actually gone to town on tearing it down? I'm not sure, but I would guess it's not a lot, because it's a PR nightmare for them.
And then also, now then what you have is you have companies like Google and Netflix and whatever that are going, if on the one hand, we might be able to make this work for ourselves. If worst case scenario, they will, but going, it could be very costly for us to do this as opposed to the alternative, right? So that exact point, businesses sometimes make changes when it's in their best interest, even if that sounds cynical. And that's kind of what we're starting to hit, which isn't surprising because like I was just pointing out, women in terms of being part of the workforce, this is just our culture and effed up until about the 70s was a really bizarre time for the United States. It gets me so incensed oftentimes talking about racism and sexism in the United States and people kind of being naive as to how recent things are. So, but one of my favorite comparisons is Major League Baseball is older than women's right to vote. And, the Civil Rights Act wasn't signed until what, the 60s? You probably know the exact year, right? 60s, right? That's
Yeah, I don't. I think it was 65 or 68, something like that.
the fact that there are basketball legends that are still alive, that are still showing up at halftime shows that were alive before civil rights were in existence. I mean, that just tells you that. So it's like we're starting at a point where you just cannot ignore women as a driver in the workforce and as a consumer base. Dave Barry brings this up a lot. The weird naivete of companies not realizing that women are customers. It's so crazy. Like, and sorry, I shouldn't be able to. It's like, it's so absurd that they don't seem to realize this. And like a common example while we're recording this is like the week after Black Panther was released, and it's like the 5th highest opening movie ever. It's like this absurdity of these old guards to not realize women and minorities as part of both the workforce and the consumer base. So I hope that's changing. And like I said, in some cases, that's my optimism for the future, because even if the government is sticking its head in the ground about many things, we're not going to get into school shooting. It's bullshit. I hate so many things so much right now, Brian, and we'll try and keep this show somewhat related. We're going to get it back to basketball in a second here, but yeah, like just the fact that I do have some optimism that businesses just are going to be forced to change because they have to, even if they don't want to.
Yeah, I agree with you on the HR point, but one thing on Black Panther real fast, I want to say I read that also 45% of the people who saw it on the opening weekend were women. So there you go. They're also watching Black Panther. But so I've got this tweet right here, and I think it summed it up nicely. So the way all this went down is this article came out, the SI article, I'm not exactly sure when, but right before it came out, the Mavs put out a PR statement to try to preempt it, right? And it was saying, we screwed up, we're going to do a full investigation, we fucked up, basically, right? And the immediate response to that is, good guy Mark Cuban, right? He's trying to do the right thing. Then the article comes out, and it's like, maybe he helped do the cover-ups. Now people aren't as sure. But this tweet I saw right after that Mavs statement came out, and this is from GWIS, GWISS. He's an editor at Sacktown Royalty, the SB Nation Kings blog, a major blog. And here's what he agrees with you. Most corporate HR departments exist to protect the company, not the employee. Mavs fired their HR director because they failed to do the former, not the latter. So I'm not going to say if Mark Cuban is a good or bad guy based on any of this. I don't really know. I don't know him personally. But he's just in damage control right now. I mean, this does not have anything to do with him being a good or bad guy.
I hate to be honest, just for people, like, remember the Donald Sterling fallout resulted in him making $2 billion.
Yeah.
It's not, I hate to be the Easter Bunny isn't real guy, but at the end of this story, the worst case scenario is that Mark Cuban's going to walk away with billions of dollars. And I do find that you can accept one of two stories and either is fine. You can think that Mark Cuban is a very hands-on owner. Don't forget he is regularly included in photo shoots with the Dallas Mavericks title. He is routinely on the sidelines. He's one of the most vocal owners. He argues the most. He talks the most. He shows up at things like Sloan. You can take the impression that he's a very hands-on owner, and then he said stuff like that. I mean, I'm sure we don't have the time or the editor. I wish I could afford this, but like somebody to go through like Shark Tank to talk about him saying how he deals with his investments and what he's going to do, right? So like, I'm hands-on. I keep appraised, right? So you can take that image of him, right? The shrewd businessman that is involved heavily with his team and knows everything. And if that's the case, this almost 20-year scandal, it would be the pinnacle of ineptitude for someone that says that's what they do, to not have any idea. Or you can take the other side. He didn't know anything about it, and basically a lot of the Mark Cuban facade that we have seen for years now is just that. I ruined my punchline word, Brian, the facade, right? A lot of what we've seen of
I
Mark
call
Cuban,
it a veneer, but facade is good too.
God. Okay, but yeah, just exactly that, right? That all of this image that Cuban has been putting up for the last 20 years as being a hands-on owner, being involved, being analytics-driven, is a veneer, because if he didn't know this, then that's huge. So I'm curious to see where this goes. As I mentioned, hats off to Jessica Luther, really just one of the best in the business. And
here's a question I want to ask, Dre. I have no idea if this is true or not, and I'll let you keep going after this, but is the fact that Jessica Luther lives in Texas and just happened to be like geographically nearby this, maybe she caught wind of it because of that? Is that possible? Like,
I will not. I'm going to be what we were saying. I'm going to be the wise person. I'm not speaking for Jessica Luther at all. Yeah. And in fact, I would not disservice to her as an amazing.
Absolutely. But the only reason why I go there is because maybe this is going on with 29 other NBA teams, right? Like, and she just happens to be the best investigative journalist going on right now, and happens to be in Texas. And here's my next point on all this. Let's teleport back 20 years ago, and you're Mark Cuban trying to figure out what to do in this situation. Well, he's pretty experienced in business already at that point. How many businesses do you think he's had to deal with people like this in already before he caused the Mavericks? Probably several, right? Like, this is just how business is done, like you're saying.
Well, like I said, what's fascinating, and this is fine. This is just how the world works, and this is one reason we tend to hate sports owners, because they basically try and act like business people while ignoring how business works. Think about being someone that was in the typewriter business, or someone who was in like AOL, right? Like internet by the hour business, right? All of these other businesses very quickly saw a rapid change in something. We can say technology, market, etc. And that caused a dramatic shift, and that just caused some companies to be left by the wayside. And so what we're essentially seeing, to what you're saying 20 years ago, is there has been a very real, and I would argue for the better, change in a lot of cultures. We're seeing it a lot in Hollywood. We're seeing it a lot in sports. Like I said, I really hope politics catches up too. And that's not a bad thing, but that's what makes this interesting, is we're talking about quote unquote mistakes made 20 years ago. And I'm not saying they weren't mistakes from an ethical standpoint. That's what's rough, by the way. I always hate this. Business and ethics, and like what we've mentioned, right? What we think would be best for the players, what we think would be best for the fans, is not always what's best for the NBA team, right? If an NBA team is able to charge $1,000 a ticket and keep most of their fans out, but they have the demand to fill the stadium, there's no reason they shouldn't do that from a business standpoint. But if you're going to argue they're taking public money and should be making it so that it's kind of a community good that everybody in the community could enjoy, it's wrong, right? That's always a trade-off. But what I was just going to say is 20 years ago, there was a very different set of rules in place, clearly, for how you were allowed to treat, sucks to say this, women in the workplace. And I'm glad that it's changing. So it is interesting to kind of say it was a mistake, where it really is just a rapid market shift. I don't have much else to say on the subject, Brian. I'd like to get into tanking. I'd like to get back to more sillier topics, just to put it lightly. So if you have anything to cap that off with, if not, we'll head into tanking.
No, just that it's pretty early on in this cycle, and there's a lot to come out here. I feel like there's a lot more shoes to drop. We don't really know what's going on. Just a little bit more on this. There's, Mark Cuban has a quote here saying, so he's getting interviewed for SI about this article, and he said, "It's wrong, it's abhorrent, it's not a situation we condone. I can't tell you how many times, particularly since all this Me Too stuff has been coming out recently, that I asked our HR director, do we have a problem? Do we have any issues I have to be aware of? And the answer was no." So is he just lying there? Or is it, here's another possibility, Dre. Maybe he forgot. Like, maybe he's gone through so many sexual harassment things that he just forgot that these all happened. Like, that's possible too.
I don't want to get, so by the way, I'm gonna use
like,
this
that's how bad this is, Dre.
I don't want to talk about Mark Cuban. I'll just use this as a generic segue, and just a myth I want to attack, because I've been mentioning the last 2 weeks, so I'll make it 3 weeks in a row now, the King of Kong controversy. So Billy Mitchell, one of the world high scorers for Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, It's recently basically been a lot of evidence has been pushed forward. Apollo Legend is the person I was thinking of a few shows ago. You can look up Apollo Legend. They're a much bigger name on YouTube than I am, so but we'll give them the props. Went through a lot of evidence about why Billy Mitchell's high scores, all of the ones not done in the 80s, are bullshit, basically. And then additionally, Todd Rogers, another big name in former classical games, same thing, same shoe drops. The point being, you have these people like Billy Mitchell that get in front of a camera and they lie. And a common, so I'm pointing at Billy Mitchell here, so we're clear. Billy Mitchell gets in front of the camera and lies. And that's one of the things Apollo Legend does in some of his videos. He breaks down some of the interviews with Billy Mitchell and is just like, this is untrue. This doesn't make any sense. And the same thing just happened with Trump in this election. There is this very real belief, I find, that people go, why would so-and-so lie about X? It's so easy to tell that they're lying. Why would they do it?
There's a documented HR paper trail, right?
Yeah. And so one of my favorite books, and this actually influenced Dave Barry's second book, Stumbling on Wins. It's called Stumbling on Happiness. Dan Gilbert, part of the behavioral psychology crowd that everybody in the basketball advanced stats community proclaims to love. This is Amos Tversky. This is Daniel Kahneman. This is Richard Thaler, who just won a Nobel Prize and did research in the NFL draft. All of these people that are golden child that everybody proclaims to love but doesn't seem to read their stuff. Dan Gilbert, not the owner. This is what's funny right there, is a behavioral.
Thinking Fast and Slow is a thick, dense book, Dre.
It is not an easy read. No. Thinking Fast and Slow was essentially Blink. Blink was essentially Thinking Fast and Slow, if that makes any sense in narrative form. And the irony is most people read about halfway, didn't finish. They read the Thinking Fast part and didn't read the Thinking Slow part of Blink, which is one of my favorite parts.
And now there's a Michael Lewis book about it, so there you go. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
I'm hoping to get through. I still need to get through that. But anyway, what I was going to note is that Dan Gilbert brings up this very human fallacy of, if I tell you something, if I tell you all armadillos are purple, that's a false statement. That's easy to confirm. Your brain is an old machine. Your brain, despite the fact that humans are amazing creatures, we have this brain that is hardwired in many ways for a world that no longer exists. Fight or flight doesn't make sense. We don't have to scavenge for sugar, basically, right? Like, sugar is plentiful, but the reason so many of us love sugar and have a problem with it and obesity is like our body's been trained. This is a rare resource. So anyway, your brain has a flaw that if I present it with information, its first instinct is to treat it as fact. And then this is the thinking fast versus thinking slow. Your fast system basically says armadillos are purple. Got it. Your thinking slow system is the one that does recall and says, wait a minute, here's what I've seen, or we go to the internet and look it up and say it's not true. People lie all the time, and it's so easy, and it's so easy for them to get away with it. We've mentioned this so many times about sports and other things. People don't do the due diligence of looking things up. It's why the rumor mill, right? Like, someone says a rumor, and we've seen this happen more than once, where someone makes a parody rumor that gets picked up. We did it on the air once, and it was Brent Barry retweeted a rumor about, this was a year before it happened, Jimmy Butler to the Wolves. And I was like, holy cow, Jimmy Butler to the Wolves. I didn't think about it, right? I
forgot about this.
I was like, Brent Barry retweeted it. I'm going to say it. Brent Barry saw it, retweeted it immediately. It didn't hit that system and said, hey, maybe I should, maybe this sounds weird. Maybe I should look it up. So that's the point. It is very easy to lie, and people do it all of the time. And this myth that people won't lie about things that are patently false is just wrong. We have a president that got into office, and annoyingly, you know someone on Facebook, all of us, to everybody listening, to everybody watching, someone on Facebook that at face value has taken things that Donald Trump has said. Many of us have relatives that have sent us chain mails that are like, Obama's going to take all of our guns and wasn't born in the United States. That's one of the things that Trump got big on. It is so easy to lie. So I get very annoyed when people see interviews. So sorry to call you out on this, Brian, where you're trying to be the good guy, Brian, but it's like, when we see interviews and we're like, well, maybe this and this and this, it's like, you know what? I hate to tell you this. People lie all the time, and it's remarkably easy to lie. And all we've done, at least in the first segment, is present this to you, this big article. Well, I'll put it in the show notes. Go read the Sports Illustrated piece by Jessica Luther. And we've said his name like 5 times. I'm hating my memory. John Wertheim. Check it out. It's an amazing read. We've presented you with those facts, and you can basically kind of go from there. And we're going to see much more. This isn't done, right? But
no, and you're exactly right. Like that's the reason I brought this up. Is it's we're wondering, is he lying or not? And it's not even clear. So with Trump, for instance, what most people close to him say is that he doesn't even think he's lying, that he just makes up his own reality and actually believes it. So
And that's a very real human issue that I mean that gets even harder. We're talking metacognition. I'll move us off some subject.
Yeah, let's go to tanking.
But yeah, so anyway, people can lie. Okay, so anyway, so tanking, we just mentioned, same problem. Like, I can't believe this is the lesser problem he'd have to deal with. Mark Cuban getting fined over $500,000 for basically admitting they're tanking. And this comes up every year, even among friends that I respect in this community. Tanking doesn't work. So here's some explanations I want to give you just as background. The NBA, right before the Michael Jordan draft, had some problems with teams, including the Chicago Bulls tanking. So basically, that's one of the strongest drafts. And the two big names, by the way, I do want this clear, were Hakeem Olajuwon and Sam Bowie. Everybody wanted these two guys. Sam Bowie was actually a huge hype prospect around the same time as Ralph Sampson, but he went down injured in college but came back. So essentially, think of this very much in the Kevin Durant, Greg Oden-ish draft. There were two huge names, huge big men, right? Michael Jordan was kind of the beginning of the you need a shooting guard to win era in the NBA. Most people before then were like, oh my God, that highly touted big Ralph Sampson and Hakeem Olajuwon are the two I keep bringing up. Everybody wanted them. The system in that place was if you were the worst team in your division, you basically went to a coin flip playoff where they flipped a coin to determine if you were the worst team in your division, you flipped a coin against other people and whoever won the coin toss went up. So essentially, like, you could be like the 10th worst team in the league, but if you were the worst team in your division, kind of the opposite. I'll bring up the Mavericks again. I wrote a couple articles. One of the articles I wrote was about the Dallas Mavericks basically in 2003, how their playoff seeding really, really hurt them for winning a title because they went through a much harder strength of schedule than the Spurs did to the conference finals, and they fell to the Spurs. And this all just had to do with the fact that the Spurs and Mavericks were in the same conference, and the NBA, the way they did it then is that whoever won the division got that the top seed that division was eligible for, and the other person got a worse seed. So the Mavericks, instead of getting the number 2 seed, which they should have been entitled to, they got like the number 4 seed and played a harder schedule all the way through. So anyway, same exact principle, right? You could be your division, you could be in a bad division, and so you'd have to be a really bad team to get a good draft pick, or you could be in a fairly good division. You didn't have to be that bad to get a good draft pick. And so it made sense from that perspective to tank because your odds of getting a top 3 pick by just losing a couple extra games was huge. So the NBA, in response to this, the first thing they did is they went full on lottery, meaning if you weren't in the playoffs, your odds were just get whatever, right? Just 1 in 14 are your chances. Wasn't 1 in 14 back then because there were only 28 teams. 1 in 12. Your odds were 1 in 12 of getting the number 1 pick. They just picked it random. And there was a lot of controversy around that in the Knicks because the Knicks won the number 1 pick doing that, and they believed that David Stern cheated and marked the envelope so he could know how to get it there. I love the conspiracy theories on this. Some believe that the envelope ear was marked. Some say that he put his hand in the thing, like the little bingo whatever, to grab it. Some claim that they put it in the freezer so it was cold so he could tell by temperature, whatever. So anyway, the final system that they adopted that's been in place since 1990 is the weighted draft lottery system, which basically says if you are the worst team in the NBA, your odds are 1 in 4 of getting the number 1 pick. And you're guaranteed a top 3 pick, but you only get a 1 in 4 shot of that. And so we've basically noted how tanking is just a horrendous strategy as a result, because you have to lose a ton of games. You have to be one of the worst teams in the NBA. And they stopped doing it by division. That's the key. It was just straight record, right? So when the 76ers tanked, they had one of the worst records ever. When the Charlotte Bobcats tanked, was it Hornets, Bobcats, whatever they were at the time, right? Whatever Michael Jordan's team. I believe it's the Hornets now. When they tanked to try and get Karl Anthony Towns, they put up the worst record in NBA history to get this. And that means that in order to try and get a top 3 draft pick via tanking, you have to give up the entire season. You can't even start tanking at the end of the season because by that point, there are horrible teams. Like at this point, right, at this point, if you wanted to, let's say stock the stupid treadmill of mediocrity meme. This is this myth that was brought up by Ken. It's Pritchard, his last name. It starts with a K as his first name. I apologize for forgetting.
Kevin Pritchard. He was GM of the Trailblazers at the time, I think, but he's been a GM.
And so his argument was, you didn't want to be a mid-40s win team in either just missing the playoffs or that 8th seed, because if you were in that spot, you basically could never get a star and you would just stay a 40-win team forever and ever and ever, and that was bad, which is stupid logic for a variety of reasons. One is making the playoffs is just free money. It's the fact that NBA teams will come forward and say we're losing money and then simultaneously argue it's a bad thing to just make a couple $1 million from a one-round playoff exit is bizarre as hell to me. And in the cases we've seen this too, like the Portland Trailblazers had no business competing with the Warriors a few seasons back, but they did just because of injuries. Basically, they won the lottery of injuries. Chris Paul, Blake Griffin got injured, then Steph Curry got injured. It's like this team almost made the conference finals, and we've seen upsets. We've seen upsets in the playoffs. We've seen 8th-seeded teams get out of the first round more often than I would argue we've seen like teams that intentionally tank to get a star. So that's his logic. You don't want to be this mid because you can't get a star if you're in that position. Now, admittedly, the team that epitomizes that is the Houston Rockets, and they currently have the best record in the NBA. So I hate that. And then, of course, we've seen lots of stars, Giannis Antetokounmpo and Kawhi Leonard, 2 MVP caliber players have both shown up right in that range. So it's just a myth in that regard. And the cost is you have to give up an entire season because, as I was mentioning, Phoenix, Orlando, Atlanta, Dallas, Sacramento, Memphis are all 18-win teams at the moment going into the All-Star break. That means that if the Los Angeles Clippers decide they can't make the playoffs, which they're a above 500-win team, it's just the West is strong again. I love that, by the way. I love that the West might have a 500-win team that doesn't make the playoffs again. That's my favorite West to be. I just hope the Nuggets stay in contention. I hope that Nikola Jokic stays good and that backcourt stays good and that they figure out what they're doing.
He'll have a quintuple double by the end of the year, probably, Dre.
Oh, geez. So yeah, you could do that. Okay.
Fastest quintuple double ever. Quintuple? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, but anyway, point being, at this point, if you were going to try and tank, it would be impossible, right? The Los Angeles Clippers could lose out, and they're not going to have as many losses as those other teams by the end. So that means these teams that are losing intentionally, and this is the Mavericks, they're admitting it, have to give up an entire season. We are never okay with that because our logic is there are always good players available. And this is back and forth in my Twitter feed. You can follow that. There are some people I was bashing the 76ers. So here's a fun just exercise I found out today looking this up, or yesterday, recently this week. So I was saying the comment I made, and I was really thinking of the Boston Celtics when I said this, but I said all of the teams that kind of went the process tanking route were lapped by teams that just, signed good veterans. And so some good examples, right? You might think to yourself, man, the Thunder, and the Thunder are one of the few. I'll give you 3 examples that you can kind of use for the tank to get a star. The Thunder, the Spurs, and the Magic. I'll talk them in a little bit. But anyway, the Thunder, if you compare them to the Lakers who traded for Pau Gasol, or you compare them to the Boston Celtics who traded for Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett, or even a couple other teams, whatever, but basically, or Miami Heat, right, who traded for LeBron James, or signed, but was a trade, but signed for LeBron James and Chris Bosh. Those teams vastly outperformed them quicker and for longer. And then the 76ers, right, this tank model, the Boston Celtics again, right? The Boston Celtics finished last season with the best record in the East. Even if they don't hold on to it, they're looking in great position to be a top 2 or top 3 seed out East this season. And that's with one of their stars out injured. So the teams that went the route of let's get good free agents, good veterans, did way better than the teams that thought they could retool via the draft. And so someone said, who better than the 76ers did? And I actually looked it up. 2 teams that stood out to me that had similar records, right? So in theory, when Hinkie started retooling, 2 teams that were essentially the same in the NBA, mid-30s in terms of wins, were the Toronto Raptors and the Portland Trailblazers. And both of these teams basically signed good free agents. Now, we've admitted that it appears, unfortunately, that both teams didn't know what they were doing, kind of lucked into it, kind of Joe Dumars into good players, but whatever. They signed good free agents, and the Portland Trailblazers made like 4 straight playoffs, as we mentioned, got lucky and got out of a first round. And the Toronto Raptors are the best team in the East right now. So it's funny for me to see people go, the 76ers had a plan, and that's a good plan. When you can point at teams in the exact same position, and all they did is they said, what if we went after good free agents? And that is the secret to success in the NBA. That has always been the secret to success. The teams that succeed are the teams that get good free agents. Even the Bulls. So the Bulls, for instance, you can take the Bulls, the first three-peat, with Horace Grant, Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan, because that was 3 draft picks. Now, admittedly, we were talking this in this article you brought up about someone saying the best way to find an all-star is through the draft, and they say 59%. One of the flaws we have in this article is that they include draft picks that you traded for. And so that
coincidentally, there's a photo of Mark Cuban at the top of this Hoops Hype article, Dre. He's in everything we're doing today, but sorry, keep going.
So anyway, so their point is they go, you want to draft your all-star. And so players they include are players like Kobe Bryant or Dirk Nowitzki, and I'm assuming Kawhi Leonard. And the problem with that is you are allowed to trade up in the draft. You are allowed to trade into the draft. Our favorite player this season as a rookie in terms of permanent production is Jordan Bell. They just bought his draft pick. The Spurs traded up for Kawhi. That's one of our biggest problems about tanking is there's this belief I have to lose games to get a good draft pick. And the real answer is no. You can trade into the draft pick you want. Now, admittedly, getting a number 1 pick, a top 3 pick is really, really hard to get. Or you have to have some like we've seen this before, right? Like the Detroit Pistons traded for a future pick that was a number 2 pick. And the same thing happened, right? The reason the Cleveland Cavaliers ended up with a number 1 pick is that they traded the Los Angeles Clippers. They basically took on a salary dump of, I think, Baron Davis, and in exchange, they got a number 1 pick. And then that lucked into being a top pick. But that's one thing. You can trade away for future picks, which is something the 76ers used to do. You can trade away for future picks. You can trade up in the draft. You can buy draft picks. And one of the things we'd argue in the draft is there are always players we like that aren't top 15. So there's no reason you shouldn't just wait to see where those players fall and then trade up in the draft rooms. That's one of our first problems with tanking. There is no reason that you have to buy your way into a good draft pick by losing games when you can be competitive and trade for those picks. So that's the first huge thing. As I mentioned, that article that said, whatever about, all you want to draft your all-stars, excluding those things. Even the Bulls, who are one of the few examples I would give you of draft for a successful team, which I would, like I said, Michael Jordan, Horace Grant, Scottie Pippen, they traded for Scottie Pippen. So that's the other huge part. Additionally, the second three-peat, this is the one that came about with Dennis Rodman. I don't consider Michael Jordan a top 3 draft pick at that point. Michael Jordan had retired. He came back. He took the highest salary in the NBA. He could have gone anywhere he wanted. He chose the Bulls. It's the same. LeBron James does not count as a top 3 pick for the Cleveland Cavaliers anymore. He left to another team. He chose to come back. So that's another bit of the logic that I hate is basically I will give you the first 7 years kind of an NBA player's career. Realistically, it's 5, but if they want to maximize pay, it's 7. The first 7 years of an NBA player's career, you are allowed to count the credit of keeping them as them being a draft pick. Beyond that, they are a veteran that chose to resign with the team. And even if you go, well, they have their bird rights. We've seen this. We've seen players like Jimmy Butler, like Dwight Howard, that basically, like allegedly Kyrie Irving this last season, we've seen veterans that basically go, I don't want to play here. I'm going to put up a stink. I'll just address this rumor kind of because I don't know how true it is. Kawhi Leonard, this information was linked to Adrian Wojnarowski, I believe, so that's where a lot of it is. Like many people don't believe that the Spurs organization or Kawhi would be the type to leak this, and so I love conspiracy theories in the NBA. I love conspiracy theories when they're stupid because that's what I love about sports. It doesn't matter, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter who did this, whereas like real world conspiracy theory stuff with Rush right now is freaking terrifying. So anyway, the conspiracy
sometimes conspiracies are real.
The conspiracy theory is that Kawhi isn't back this season because his personal doctors say he's not cleared to play, whereas the Spurs doctors say he is cleared to play. If that's the case, by the way, I'm fully on Kawhi's side. I'm going to just point to Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah Thomas did the play-through injury in the playoffs last season, ended up being out, has not looked good, and he probably cost him. He potentially hurt himself in terms of a payday by doing that.
Richard Sherman with the Seahawks did that this year too.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, I didn't even know that. But yeah,
Yep.
So the point being, if you're a star athlete, your body is your brand and your money, and basically the loyalty to a team that might trade you away for nothing, it's not worth it. Keep yourself healthy. If there is even the hint that Kawhi's doctors say that, side with your own doctors. Now there's also, if you're going to compound in that conspiracy theory, right, it's possible that Kawhi's pulling a Kawhi is pulling a Kyrie, and their names are too similar. I'm sure I was going to get one of them wrong, and basically saying, I want off the Spurs. And if that's the case, that's definitely interesting. But that's the point. People might say, well, they have their bird rights, meaning they're able to pay that player higher than any other team. That's what the bird rights are in the NBA. They're brought about because of Larry Bird. The rule was in place saying you were allowed to go over the salary cap to re-sign your own players. And then since then, they've been expanded on to say you are able to make a better offer marginally than every other team in the NBA. The point being you want to keep your franchise players. But we have seen time and time again that players that want to get off their squad have done it. Kevin Love, Kyrie Irving, Dwight Howard, right? This happens. So like I said, I'll count the first 7 years as a rookie pick. Beyond that, you don't count as a draft pick. But you can trade up in the draft. And then like just the last point is the teams that have succeeded in the NBA. So all the way back to the Bulls. The Bulls don't count. The first three-peat does not count because those rules are no longer in place. The way the draft was that let them get Michael Jordan does not exist anymore. That draft system is gone. 1990, the draft got revamped. It's different. The Spurs are the second example I could give you. That's with Tim Duncan. And what I'll give you there is the reason they had as good of odds to get Tim Duncan, and they were still not good odds. They didn't expect it. The myth is that Greg Popovich didn't even bother to go see the opening of the envelope or whatever for the number one pick. He was getting himself a burger because he didn't think there was any shot he'd get it.
It's supposed to be the Celtics pick. Tim Duncan was supposed to go to the Celtics.
And the Nuggets had a great shot of him too.
Yeah.
But anyway, here's what happened. That season, the Vancouver Grizzlies were an expansion team. They had a worse record than the Spurs, but because they were an expansion team, they were excluded from that. So the Spurs' odds that were already bad at getting Tim Duncan are inflated because of that. And in modern drafts, they don't have expansion teams. And even if they did, the odds have gotten much worse because now we're up to 30 teams. And then finally, the Thunder, as mentioned, the Thunder were outperformed by other teams like the Celtics, like the Miami Heat. And so there was this concept that came about with the new CBA 2 CBAs ago that Daryl Morey made famous. It's called the poison pill contract. This was
Jeremy Lin, right?
Jeremy Lin is the first example. This was brilliance on Daryl Morey's. Daryl Morey and Sam Hinkie are two GMs that we have a lot of criticism for, but a lot of respect for. And, they're just like NBA players. We love them both. So Daryl Morey, though, what he figured out is the way the new salary system worked is that it penalized you if you were a repeat offender above the salary cap. And the rules said that when you signed someone to a contract, you could structure their deal in such a way that if you were under the cap, you could give Jeremy Lin a $24 million a year contract and structure it such that it was $8 million, $8 million, $8 million. But if you were over the cap, you could structure it such that it was like $6 million, $8 million, $10 million, and there was a repeat offender clause. And that repeat offender clause took the third year, not the average, the third year. So basically, you could offer Jeremy Lin a contract that said, I know the Knicks are going to be a repeat offender by this year. I'm going to offer Jeremy Lin a contract structured in such a way that third year, that extra $2 million I'm giving him that year with how I've structured the contract is actually going to be $6 million. So I'm going to make that contract basically twice as expensive. I'm going to make them pay $16 million in that third year for an $8 million a year contract. And that makes it a poison pill. They don't want to swallow the pill, and they let them go. Because what happens often in restricted free agency is you offer a deal, the team just matches. But Daryl Morey figured that tweak about it, and that's what happened. So the exact same thing kind of happens, though, if you go the draft pick method, which is what happened with Kevin Durant, James Harden, and Russell Westbrook. If you draft 3 stars in a row, which is rare, it rarely happens. Like
they drafted Ibaka as well, right, during that run.
But he was. I'm saying if you go the tank for a top 3 pick.
Oh, Ibaka was like 15th, right?
Yeah,
so he's in count. Okay.
If your method of tanking is, I'm going to tank 4 years in a row, which is essentially what the 76ers did.
I just did something I'm about to complain about, but go ahead.
What do you got?
No, I'm gonna say about this article coming up that conflating building through the draft with tanking, and that's what I just did. But I want you to finish your point.
Okay, but so if you tank multiple times, right? If the goal being I'm going to acquire a couple of top 5 picks, which is what the 76ers did, and hopefully 2 or 3 of them will be stars, and I'm going to build around those stars. The problem is all of their contracts go up at the same time because you're very cheap as a rookie, and then you're eligible for a boost, right? Joel Embiid just signed a huge contract. And rest assured, Ben Simmons in 2 seasons is going to be up for a huge contract. And so that's what happens too. If you tank to try and rebuild your team or build through the draft, you essentially end up with a bunch of contracts poison pilling themselves at the same time so that your salary cap explodes. And that puts you in a very awkward position, which the Oklahoma City Thunder ended up in. And sometimes you lose stars. And the last point I'll make, this is the Orlando Magic. Now, not quite a tanking situation. They lucked in. They won the draft for Shaquille O'Neal, which is huge. That's like a Ben Simmons-like player. And then, despite the fact that they were a 40-42 win team, I believe, so 40 wins, 42 losses team, they lucked into the number 1 pick, which was Chris Webber, and then they traded down for Penny Hardaway and more picks. Was a coup. But then basically Shaq and Penny, two young players coming up at the same time, basically started feuding, and Shaq, through a variety of reasons, went the other way. And we've seen the same kind of thing happen, right? Potentially just happen with Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant. So this idea of, I'm going to get a bunch of young players, they're going to be stars, they're going to get along, and somehow I'm going to be able to juggle the fact that their contracts are going to go like up by 5 to 10x. It's just incredibly naive and has only really worked, I would argue, one time successfully.
I agree. I don't think the Spurs were tanking at all.
Well, the Spurs with Tim Duncan, them working out. Okay, so that's. I'm sorry, you're bringing me back to the last point. There's so much on this subject, obviously. Last point too. The two teams that you would argue tanked and succeeded, and although, like I mentioned, the Celtics didn't succeed because they tried to tank for Kevin Durant, is allegedly who they were going for. They tanked for Kevin Durant. They didn't get Kevin Durant. They got Jeff Green, but then they traded away for Kevin Garnett. Here's a few points about that scenario. One, Paul Pierce was injured that season on the bench. He came back. Not only did he come back, he came back healthy. That is huge, right? Gordon Hayward is sidelined this season. We want to believe he'll be back healthy next year. There's no guarantee. Just look at Derrick Rose. Just look at the number of times we've seen a top player. Look at Grant Hill. Top player goes down injured. There's huge excitement they'll come back healthy. That's not a guarantee. Paul Pierce went down injured, came back healthy. For the Spurs, they got Tim Duncan, true, but they had David Robinson.
David Robinson missed the entire year. That's the only reason they were bad. David
Robinson missed out and came back, and more importantly, came back healthy. So the key is, if you're going to tank for a top pick, you need a finals MVP worthy player injured on your bench that comes back healthy, which is never a guarantee. Additionally, for the Boston Celtics, when they tanked and lucked into it, they got Ray Allen, who convinced Kevin Garnett to come over. But they got Ray Allen. I tweeted about this today on Twitter. But the bizarre thing, have you ever seen the movie Major League?
Oh, yes.
So the concept in Major League...
I saw this tweet, actually.
The concept in Major League is the wife of a former owner of the Cleveland Indians inherits the team. And she says if she loses enough games, there's a clause in the contract such that she can relocate the team to Miami.
And she's the villain, right? She's like a Cruella de Vil stuck-up rich lady.
Now, what's funny, so I want to give a brief tangent on this movie. That movie was actually Moneyball before Moneyball. Because the original script of the movie is the team was out of money. So she came up with a lie that she told this boardroom. So she was a very smart, savvy woman, but she came up with a lie to tell her boardroom of stodgy old white guys why she was losing, and that she was going to lose by acquiring a bad roster. But really, she moneyballed it, and she looked for a bunch of really productive, undervalued players that were going to win. So that's the funny thing, is that was the original. But then what happened is when they did test screenings and she came up to the manager and said, look, I'm not moving the team to Miami. That's BS. What happened is I'm out of money, right? I just inherited this really bad team. I'm out of money. The only way I have stand a chance of competing is hiring all of these players that are undervalued assets. And I have to sell that to my boardroom, my Moneyball boardroom. So that's what I did. They hated it. They hated that. And so they just removed that scene from the movie. So the belief is that she, reorganize the team to intentionally lose, to relocate it. That happened in the NBA with the Seattle Supersonics. Clay Bennett tanked the team intentionally so that they were so bad that they wouldn't get a new arena, so that fans didn't want to pay in, so that he could justify to the NBA saying, I'm not making any money in Seattle. I have to move the team to Oklahoma City, who's buying me a new arena. So
right, and because he's from Oklahoma, right? He wants to move the team to his own city.
Exactly. But so point being, the reason the Boston Celtics were able to do the Kevin Garnett thing was because Ray Allen was available. Ray Allen's only available because this team is doing a movie plot, which is bizarre, and then Paul Pierce is healthy. So the only cases that we've seen this happen, and then as I mentioned, Tim Duncan, the Vancouver Grizzlies aren't eligible. They're not supposed to get it. They have an MVP. All of the few cases in NBA history that people can think of tanking work. The Chicago Bulls in the 80s, that system is gone. Doesn't work anymore. They've changed the system. Tim Duncan, odds are now different than they were. Finals MVP on the bench. The Oklahoma City Thunder didn't work. That's what's key too. And then also the 76ers now. It's just bizarre to see a team that's missed the playoffs 6 seasons in a row, whose GM was fired, as people saying, see, this is proof that this GM strategy was a success.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone's saying, Embiid is a surefire all-star forever, and he was voted by the fans. We didn't necessarily think his production warranted it. So, I mean, we'll see, but yeah, it's ridiculous. And so let's take a step back and look at what is the question we're actually trying to answer here, which is if I'm a bad team, if I'm running a bad team in the NBA in the offseason, should I try to tank by like trading away my good players and intentionally being bad so I can build up draft picks, right? That's really the answer to that question. And if you're talking about the Spurs, that's not what they did, right? They didn't say we were the worst or one of the worst teams in the league. We're just going to trade away David Robinson.
And we mentioned this season was fascinating, right? We saw two teams, in one case for a legit reason, in another case maybe not. The Memphis Grizzlies and the Chicago Bulls going into the trade deadline, All-Star break too, but going into the trade deadline, benched a productive player and said we're doing it because we might be trading him. And so this question of tanking via giving away your assets, and we should be clear, the 76ers, we have great respect for Sam Hinkie's draft picks, but we just argue draft picks are very volatile and there's no guarantee they're going to work out. And even if they do, right, it's taken 2 years for Ben Simmons to play, right? He missed his rookie season. It's taken 3 seasons for Joel Embiid to play. And we still don't know, right? Jury's still out. Just for perspective, they've played 55 games this season. Joel Embiid has missed 11 of those. And he still isn't playing back-to-back, and he's only averaging 31 minutes a game. So there's just no guarantee of that. So for teams to succeed, you have to sign veteran players because veteran players, we know their production, right? Rookies, it's really, really hard to predict. Veteran players are so much easier to predict. And so our complaint about the 76ers process, it wasn't that they gave up any assets that were good. They actually got rid of all their bad assets. Our complaint is that they never picked up any productive veterans.
Now, here's the simplest way I can put this, Dre, which is basically top 3 draft picks are really good, but they're not good enough versus a lower draft pick that you should justify trying to lose intentionally. Like, it's not worth it. It's just you're paying way too high of a cost. That's the problem.
If you're focusing on the draft as your method of acquiring players, you are missing out. Here's the final message I have on this. Okay, so the draft, because of the NBA rules, and this is very similar to the NBA itself in games, the draft has a set of rules about your odds for getting a draft pick. And even with those in mind, there's still lots of uncontrollable variables, right? Some drafts are just bad. Whatever draft Kenyon Martin.
I was gonna say the exact one. Yeah, that was like 1995 or something like that. It was 2000, maybe 2000. I don't know.
But anyway, you're not guaranteed the draft's going to be good. First off, there's lottery balls bouncing around to how good you're going to get. But regardless, the draft has a set of rules as to how bad you have to be as to get a pick in the range you want. And we're arguing that cost is really high. Now, the other part is the free agent market, and even the draft pick market is a market that you are able to basically take advantage of. So the draft lottery, the odds are fixed. The NBA has set the rules, and if you analyze those rules, they suck. They're not in your favor. It's going to a casino. Now, we talk about this term called arbitrage all the time that showed up in a book, The Extra 2%, and that's the idea. It's the Warren Buffett principle. You want to sell high, you want to buy low. And the NBA free agent market for veterans is a market. You wait until Jimmy Butler's trade value plummets, or Andre Iguodala. The Andre Iguodala trade to the Denver Nuggets was a masterpiece. So anyway, you wait until a player's trade value plummets and you pick them up for cheaper. Or you wait until Boston did this multiple times. They did this to get Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen, and they did this with Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce. You wait until someone's player value is high and you sell them away for more than they're worth. And so the player market basically is a very inefficient market. We still know this, right? Patrick thought that Zach LaVine was didn't realize that they had to include him. He thought that they picked him up or something. So it's kind of like the NBA trade market is highly ineffective at this, or inefficient, not ineffective. It's highly inefficient. So if you want to win in the NBA, you game the trade market. The teams that have won have gamed the trade market. The draft lottery, the odds are set, and it's an incredibly hard game to win. And every case we've seen a team win going the path that Hinkie was going for has required a huge amount of luck. So it's kind of like the skill versus chance narrative you want to go. Most people want to go for the draft lottery because the narrative is so good. But the gaming, the inefficient market is the way to win, and it's the way the good teams in the NBA have won. Now, that might be changing. That might change as the future goes on, but that it currently is still a very successful way. And it boggles my mind that people still don't realize that the Golden State Warriors, right? Andre Iguodala and Kevin Durant, I almost said Garnett. I always call Kevin Durant Garnett on accident. Those two players were free agents that were huge acquisitions and then trading for Andrew Bogut, right? Like this team, they're tanking intentionally to get like Harrison Barnes, didn't go anywhere. The thing that put them over the top, now admittedly they had Steph Curry, was great. The thing that put them over the top though was picking up these great free agent acquisitions via trade. And it's funny how little credit that gets in the NBA.
Yeah, that's right. And so my last thing on this is I want to be responsible and talk a little about this Hoops Hype article we've been referencing, but not really saying what it was. This is from Brian Kalbrowski. And so the reason why Mark Cuban is involved in this is actually, let's go to this tweet here that he put up for his article. And he says, Mark Cuban told his team that losing is their best option to improve so that they can get a good draft pick. According to research from this guy posting below to me, Alberto De Roa, he is right. 59% of All-Stars since 2000 were acquired via the NBA draft. So I hinted at this earlier and said that I kind of made a mistake doing it myself. It's easy to make this mistake, right? And that is conflating building through the draft with tanking. Now, first of all, I agree with you. There's so many good veterans and free agents out there that's really the way you want to go, right? That's going to do it. But
no, you do both. Here's so let's be clear, because at the end of this, it might come across as me saying ignore the draft, F the draft. The point is, if you're talking like a financial advisor, the draft is the high volatility, low cost area.
That's right.
So basically, you are going to, like we used to, and we'll have to talk in the future as if the Spurs have fallen off. But the Spurs used to do this all the time. They would draft incredibly good draft picks. They wouldn't expect them to be immediately productive. Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, Kawhi, none of these players came in and was immediately given the ball, right? None of these players came in and was told, you have to carry this team. And we've argued that's potentially ruinous to players. I question if Melo had gone to Detroit, if he would have become a much better player. Because Melo came to the Denver Nuggets. He was, at the time, the most efficient scorer on the team. He wasn't an efficient scorer for the NBA, but he was an efficient scorer for the Nuggets. He put the team on his back offensively, which was a bad plan. So it's the same point you made about Donovan Mitchell. Donovan Mitchell is a below-average scorer in the NBA. He takes 16 shots a game. Now, you can question whether it's Donovan Mitchell making the call or the team, but regardless, a rookie who is below average at shooting should not be taking 16 shots a game. That is either poorly constructed team or a bad run offense, one of the two. Carmelo Anthony being the primary offensive weapon as a rookie on the Nuggets is a poorly constructed team. The Spurs used to acquire players, slowly ramp them up in their system. They'd get a starting role and they'd go from there. They'd basically use the draft as a farm system, which is how it's used in most other leagues. But in the NBA, we get these players that are one and doneers and we give them the starting role. I've said the same thing about Emmanuel Mudiay with the Nuggets. The biggest complaint I have is there was no reason a rookie should have gotten that many minutes and that many shots a game. Admittedly, it wasn't really his fault. Ty Lawson had major issues, but really at that point, you sign a veteran point guard and bring him up slow.
All right, so go ahead.
So just to finish on the draft, basically saying, I think using the draft to find future players for your team is great, but you don't want to put those players into key positions immediately. And even using, so to the same article, using, say, Kobe Bryant, Dirk Nowitzki, this article is flawed on many reasons. We might talk more. But like even using those guys, they weren't immediately given the starting reins. I wrote an article a few years back on the finals MVP and just noted how many of these players weren't the key driver of their team immediately and how that might be important.
All right, so this article introduction by Brian Kalbrowski on his Twitter account, Mark Cuban told his team that losing is their best option to improve so that they can get a good draft pick. According to research from Alberto De Roa, he is right. 59% of All-Stars since 2000 were acquired via the NBA draft. So let's break this down a little bit. So 59%, is most of them, right? And you can see this graph here. There's a couple through free agency and trade. So they aren't making the argument it's definitely through the draft. But that doesn't mean. But that includes, like you said, teams like the Spurs who draft all these guys lower down in the draft and are not tanking. So this doesn't say anything about tanking to me. Second, all stars. You brought this up on the pre-show. Is saying someone an all star the best way to judge how successful they were in the draft? A lot of all stars are good, but a lot of them aren't. If you're trying to build a championship team, though, there's probably better ways to measure that, right? Since 2000, that's probably the last 18 years. That's probably a decent period of time. We could go back into the 90s, and that would include some other drafts. I'm okay with that period of time. So most of that sentence, we just kind of disagree with the premise of, right?
Well, so okay, so to break that down, and sorry, I was making sure I followed both Brian and Alberto. Okay, so first problem, right? All-star isn't a great metric necessarily for winning, and all-star doesn't even necessarily mean productive, right? Kobe Bryant was still making all-star games way past his prime. People would even admit it. It was just a fan vote, and that's how the all-star game is constructed. Second, as you noted, they're not including players that were traded for in the draft. So Kobe doesn't count in this opinion, right? Kobe was not drafted by the Lakers. Kobe, they traded a top player in, how did I just drop his name? This makes me feel terrible. He was a huge guy in the Lakers.
Yeah, it was Vlade Divac.
But
the point is they didn't tank to get the asset to acquire Kobe, right? They gave up a star they already had to get him.
Yeah, they traded for Kobe. Kobe was ramped up slowly. And if you're calling Kobe Bryant a draft pick in 2010, when he's been on the Lakers for over a decade, that's just, again, not how it worked. There were multiple occasions where Kobe thought he was leaving the Lakers. So it's just a funny bit of logic. Like I said, if you want to say that what he said, which I don't disagree with, which is most players that become all-stars originated as players that were acquired on draft night by their team. There is nothing wrong with that. But to your point with the conflating the two, nothing in that sentence equates to the best way for a team to win is to tank to get better in the draft.
Yeah, so I don't have a problem with the data they put up. It's just the conclusion, because it could have just been, well, here's all these all-stars that got drafted, right? That's fine. But to add this Mavericks part on and to say that Mark Cuban is justified, to tank because of teams built through the draft.
To do there, you have to go to 5 years. You have to look at players. You have to look at players that were drafted top 5. You have to look at players that were because that's what basically Mark Cuban's going for, right? He's keeping himself in that echelon. If you're a horrible team in the NBA, if you're like the worst record, you're guaranteed top 4. If you're the second worst, top 5, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, though, what Mark Cuban is arguing there is for that. So you'd have to look at draft picks that were top 5, that were drafted by the team via them tanking, that made it to an all-star game within, I would argue, the first 2 contracts, meaning their rookie contract and their first extension. That's the question. And I guarantee you this study, and I might redo it for fun, looks completely different if you put those restraints in.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. So they're on the right track here, and they answered me. They indulged me a little bit on Twitter. I asked for their data. They're probably not going to give that up, but I'd be interested in seeing their data.
Although I said this last week. I'm just going to put out the admission that I am a software developer. We are going to be perpetually behind on what we want to do. That's been the case for years, so it shouldn't be a surprise to you to admit it, but at least we'll admit it. There's other data to clean up. I really want to clean up the position adjustment. I really want it to go game by game. Ideally, I'd want it to go based off lineup data, but cross that bridge when we get to it. We're at the point in the season where the Yahoo data stream, and we kind of realized this last year, and I really should have fixed it in the offseason, but had a kid instead. Basically, the Yahoo data stream is not where we want it, and we have to correct the position adjustment, and that's on the back burner. So there are other things I would want to do too, this included. So I'm not as worried as much about that data. But yeah, but to that point, when I'm saying like these are data ideas I have, like we're just going to perpetually be behind on what we want to do. I've kind of known this for years. I've said this jokingly for years on the podcast, but I'll just say it in earnest here. We're always going to be behind. Let's see. There's more to say on the Spurs, but we're again 2 weeks in a row where we've gone over an hour.
Ray, just real fast to finish up on this. I've said this to you a million times, but I just want to say it. If anyone's listening to the first time, I've always thought that tanking is an excuse from GMs and owners to not win for their fans. Right? It's a way to say, oh, we don't we're not trying and we don't even have to try. It's better for us not to try to win. I think it's an excuse.
It is very effective PR that we can just look at NBA Twitter. Like I said, the Philadelphia 76ers have not made the playoffs in 6 seasons. They are probably going to get bounced in the first round this year. The player, we noted this, right? If Robert Covington doesn't play like an MVP the first 30 games in the season, they don't have a 500 record going into the All-Star break. They're probably going to get bounced in the first round this season. The GM got fired. The fact that people are still using the 76ers as any example of success in the NBA is baffling, but it's the exact same narrative. Like skill curves are one of these too. There are narratives in the NBA that just won't die because they sound so good. The treadmill of mediocrity is related to tanking too. And that's all we can say.
Here's my message to Adam Silver. He keeps coming up with ways, here's how we're going to fix tanking. Adam Silver, here's how you fix tanking. You come up with a PR surge saying tanking doesn't work, and teams that tank are being derelict in the duties to their fans. That's how Adam Silver fixes tanking. He has a PR surge. That's all I have to say on that.
Interesting. All right, I like it. We'll just do as a shout out. LeBron James won his third All-Star MVP. Heck of a game. Huge point. James Harden just forgot how to shoot. Maybe he partied too much or something. But still a fun game. In the last game, the last play of the game, I believe, was, if I'm not mistaken, LeBron James and Kevin Durant completely locking down Steph Curry. So there you go.
Yeah, there were some tweets saying something like LA nightlife is undefeated, or I don't know.
Definitely like the system. I do want to give a shout out, not a shout out, a callback. So in past, we mentioned how stupid it was on the NBA's part. So what they did is they did schoolyard rules, 2 captains, Curry and LeBron. So the top player in each respective conference gets to be a captain. They pick teams. And we didn't get to see this happen. And I was like, man, the NBA is so stupid. This is stupid. What I've heard, and I believe is the case, is the NBA's Players Association said, no, we don't want to do that, and just wouldn't budge on it. And so basically, I apologize to the NBA. It was a good idea. Just sometimes they don't agree. And I can't also fault the players either for that, because if you've got players that are like, my draft stock is based on people's perception of me. I don't want to show other players not like me, or also players going, I don't want it to look like I don't like this player. So please don't start any public drama that's going to explode on Twitter. No complaint. So it's a case where I can see both sides point. There was a funny tweet from Joel Embiid where he said that D'Antoni said his plan for him was to have him shoot 15 threes. He did take 4 3-point shot attempts and made as many as James Harden. They both made 2. Clearly, the reason they lost this game is Joel Embiid should have taken 15 threes. I would have loved to see that. As mentioned, I'll be at Sloan. I'm flying out tomorrow morning, so if you're out at Sloan this week, let me know. Hit me up on Twitter. Definitely would love to see anybody else who is out there. I've got some T-shirts, so excited about that. Hopefully, we'll get some content. Anyway, Brian, I'll let you end with whatever you want, a shout out, a capper, and then I'll lead us out.
Just on the All-Star break, they stole the draft idea from the NHL, who televises their draft already. So there's a blueprint for it. They need to televise that stuff. And
it's just a case where the Players Association and the league couldn't agree. And I like I said, I see both points. So it's annoying. And it's one of those where here's hoping in the future that the players and the owners get along more than they do now.
Yeah, and last thing is, even though I'm bad-mouthing Embiid's play and being anointed too early, I love him so much. I'm so glad he's in the league and is considered a star, because he's just the best personality ever. So I'm rooting for him to do well.
We're rooting for Embiid to do well. We never, in his case, the only real downside he has is injury, and we've made this point before. We never root for injury. I never consider my point proven when a player gets injured. So it's going to be slightly annoying, and I'm going to have to admit this at the end of the season. I'm probably going to be right on the Oklahoma City Thunder, how they finished the season, and Melo being mediocre at offense. But they looked fantastic when they had a starting lineup of George, Westbrook,
Robertson,
however you said.
Yeah.
That's actually a really potent starting 5, and with Melo, basically he stopped shooting, which was the right maneuver, and was apparently helping on D. So that team looked really strong, stronger than I was expecting. A lot of that, like I said, is Steve Adams and Roberson. So I might look right at the end of the season, but I'm gonna, as I mentioned in the article, this was a shout out. We said I wrote an article about how preseason predictions are just crap at this point, how 19 teams in the NBA have had major enough changes to personnel such that I don't give you, it sounds mean, I give you no credit for your preseason prediction, because the situation is so different that if you were told that at the beginning of the season, you would not have had the same take. That's just where we're at. Anyway, this has been the Boxscore Geek Show. If you found us not through the website, you can find our tools and analysis at boxscoregeeks.com. You can find the blog write-ups of the show and other blog content I make at nerdnumbers.com. We go live every week, twitch.tv/nerdnumbers, Wednesdays, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, barring a holiday. If you missed the live show, you can catch the recaps. Channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. We are on iTunes and Stitcher, the Boxscore Geek Show. Subscribe, upvote, helps us out. I've been your host, Ray Alvarez. You can find me on Twitter as Nerd Numbers. Co-host, Voice of God, Man of Many Hats, Brian Foster. You can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Not with us tonight, but with us in spirit. Co-host Patrick Minton. You can find on Twitter as NBA Geek. That's been our show, and we'll see you next week.